Imagine being called the most powerful man in the world, yet you cannot step outside your own palace without permission. Imagine wearing a crown so heavy that it crushed every dream, every friendship, every human desire you ever had. Imagine sitting on a throne made of gold, surrounded by servants and soldiers, and still feeling more trapped than the poorest man in your kingdom. That is not fiction. That is the true story of 10 kings and emperors who ruled entire civilizations but could not rule their own lives. These were men who had armies, palaces, and absolute titles, and yet every single one of them was a prisoner, not in chains, not behind iron bars, but imprisoned by politics, by family, by forces so powerful that no crown could protect them. Let us go through them one by one, and by the end of this, you will never look at power the same way again. Puyi was the last emperor of China, and his story begins in the most surreal way imaginable. He was 2 years old when they placed him on the dragon throne. 2 years old. A child who could barely speak full sentences was suddenly the ruler of the largest empire on earth. He did not choose this. He did not understand this. He was carried into the Forbidden City by strangers, placed on a massive throne that swallowed his tiny body, and surrounded by hundreds of bowing adults who called him the Son of Heaven. Every single decision of his early life was made by eunuchs, court officials, and regents who used his name and his crown to serve their own interests. What he ate, where he walked, who he spoke to, none of it was his choice. When the Republican Revolution came in 1912, he was forced to abdicate at age 6, still not old enough to understand what abdication even meant. He was allowed to stay in the Forbidden City as a ceremonial ghost emperor for a few more years, until warlords literally marched in and threw him out in 1924. Then came the darkest chapter. The Japanese found him, saw his value as a symbol, and installed him as the puppet emperor of Manchukuo, a fake state they created in northeastern China. He had a throne room, a title, a uniform, and zero power. Every order came from Japanese handlers. Every policy was Japanese policy. He was a costume, not a king. When the Soviets captured him at the end of World War II, he was tried as a war criminal for crimes he had no real role in committing. He was sent to a re-education camp in communist China and emerged years later as a common citizen, eventually working as a gardener in Beijing, the same city where he had once been worshipped as a living god. He died in 1967 with nothing. Born with everything, died with nothing. That is the complete arc of Puyi's life, and it is one of the most haunting stories in all of human history. Henry VI of England was a man so fundamentally unsuited to his throne that it almost seems like a cruel joke of fate that he was born into it. He was gentle, deeply spiritual, almost monastic in his temperament, the kind of person who would have made a wonderful scholar or a priest, but who was an absolute disaster as a medieval king. He inherited the throne as an infant, and from the very beginning, powerful nobles fought over who would control him and therefore control England. As he grew up, it became clear that Henry had neither the appetite nor the instinct for the brutal political chess game that surrounded him. He suffered at least one complete mental breakdown, during which he sat entirely unresponsive for over a year, unable to speak, unable to recognize his own wife, unable to react even when his son was born and brought to him. During this time, England was effectively kingless, and the power vacuum tore the country apart. The Wars of the Roses, that savage, decades-long conflict between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, consumed his entire reign. He was captured, restored, captured again, imprisoned in the Tower of London, briefly put back on the throne by allies, and then imprisoned again. He was used as a banner, a symbol, a legitimizing token by whatever faction happened to be winning that month. He did not fight. He did not scheme. He prayed. And in the end, likely on the orders of the Yorkist king Edward IV, he was murdered in the Tower. A man who wanted nothing to do with power was destroyed entirely by it. Sultan Mustafa I of the Ottoman Empire never had a chance, and the reason why is one of the most disturbing institutional practices in royal history. The Ottoman system had a solution to the problem of princes competing for the throne. They locked them up. Literally. Princes were confined to a section of the palace called the kafes, which translates simply as the cage. No education, no training, no exposure to statecraft, no meaningful human relationships. Just four walls, a few servants, and silence, sometimes for decades. Mustafa spent years inside the kafes before he was suddenly pulled out and declared sultan. The damage was already done. His mind, deprived of normal human development and stimulation during his most formative years, had fractured. He wandered the palace hallways in confusion. He could not hold audiences or make decisions. He reportedly tried to free the fish in the palace pools, talking to them as if they were his companions. He was removed from power, placed back in the kafes, brought out again when it suited the political establishment, and removed again. He was sultan twice and a prisoner for most of his life. He was never a ruler. He was a prop. Charles II of Spain is one of the most medically tragic figures ever to sit on a European throne, and his story is a direct consequence of one of the most reckless experiments in human genetics that history has ever recorded: royal inbreeding. The Habsburg dynasty, in its obsession with keeping power within the family, had been marrying cousins, aunts, and nieces for so many generations that by the time Charles was born, his family tree had collapsed into a single line. His inbreeding coefficient, a scientific measure of genetic overlap, was higher than that of a child born to two siblings. The results were catastrophic. He could not chew food because his jaw was so malformed. He could not speak clearly. He suffered epileptic episodes, hallucinations, and near constant illness. He could barely walk without support. His body was failing from the moment he was born, and yet he was placed on the throne of one of the most powerful empires on earth, controlling Spain, vast parts of Europe, and enormous colonial territories across the Americas. His mother ruled for him first. Then foreign powers, France, Austria, England, spent his entire reign scheming to control who would succeed him, because everyone could see that Charles was dying and had no heirs. He was not a king making decisions. He was a dying man being kept alive just long enough to sign documents. He died at 38, and the struggle over his succession immediately ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped all of Europe. His entire reign was not a reign. It was a waiting room. Emperor Guangxu of China was perhaps the most heartbreaking case on this list, because unlike the others, he actually tried. He saw China falling behind the Western powers. He understood the need for reform, and in 1898, he launched what became known as the 100 Days Reform, a sweeping program to modernize China's military, education system, and government. For 100 days, he poured everything he had into this effort, issuing decree after decree, working with progressive advisors, genuinely believing he could pull his country into the modern world. And then, his aunt ended it. Empress Dowager Cixi, the most powerful woman in Chinese history and arguably the most powerful person in China, period, staged a coup. She canceled every single reform, arrested Guangxu's advisors, had some of them executed, and locked Guangxu himself on a small island called Yingtai inside a lake in the Forbidden City. He remained there for 10 years. 10 years on a small island, completely isolated, while Cixi ruled China in his name. He could see the palace from his island. He could see the life he was supposed to be living. He watched China continue to collapse under foreign pressure, unable to do a single thing about it. He died in 1908 at just 37 years old, and modern forensic testing has confirmed what historians long suspected. He was poisoned with arsenic. He died one day before Cixi herself, almost certainly on her orders, so that he could not outlive her and undo her legacy. He spent his entire adult life fighting for his country from inside a cage he never chose. Ranavalona III was the last queen of Madagascar, and her story is one of the clearest examples of what happens when a sovereign has all the dignity and intelligence in the world, but no army capable of stopping colonial violence. She was educated, she was strategic, She was genuinely devoted to her people and her island. She modernized her court. She engaged with European diplomats. She tried every possible avenue to maintain Madagascar's independence as French colonial pressure intensified around her. She negotiated. She appealed. She demonstrated that Madagascar was a civilized, governed state that deserved to be treated as an equal. France did not care. In 1895, French forces invaded. In 1896, France formally annexed Madagascar. In 1897, Ranavalona was exiled, first to the island of Réunion and then to Algiers in Algeria, where she lived as a prisoner for the rest of her life, thousands of miles from the island she had spent everything trying to protect. She had a title that meant nothing. She had a crown that sat in a French vault. She died in Algiers in 1917, and her body was only returned to Madagascar decades later. She had all the qualities of a great ruler and none of the power to act on them. King Ludwig II of Bavaria is often remembered as the Mad King, the dreamer who built fairy tale castles in the Bavarian Alps and disappeared into fantasy while his government fell apart. But the reality is far more complicated and far more sad. Ludwig was deeply introverted, genuinely uninterested in the ceremonies and political theater that kingship required, and found his only real peace in music, architecture, and the operas of Richard Wagner, whom he funded almost single-handedly. He was not mad. He was simply a person of intense artistic sensibility who had been placed in a role that demanded the exact opposite. His ministers grew increasingly frustrated with his refusal to engage with governance. They wanted a king who would appear at functions, sign documents, and be the political face of Bavaria. Ludwig wanted to build Neuschwanstein Castle and listen to Wagner. The conflict became irreconcilable. In 1886, a government commission declared him mentally unfit to rule, a declaration based on testimonies from doctors who had never even examined him in person, and he was removed from power and placed under house arrest at Berg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg. 3 days later, Ludwig and his psychiatrist were found dead in the lake, under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. He was 40 years old. He had not been mad. He had simply refused to be the king they wanted him to be, and that refusal cost him everything. Alfonso XIII of Spain has one of the strangest royal biographies in European history, because he was technically king from the moment of his birth. His father, Alfonso XII, died before he was born, so the throne passed directly to the unborn child, with his mother serving as regent until he came of age. He grew up knowing that he was king, that his entire existence was political, that every choice he made carried national consequences, and the consequences kept coming. His reign was defined by catastrophe after catastrophe, colonial wars, political instability, the devastating annual disaster of 1921, in which Spanish forces were routed in Morocco with massive casualties, and ultimately the rise of a military dictatorship under Primo de Rivera, which Alfonso supported, which then collapsed, which then destroyed whatever remained of his public legitimacy. By 1931, when municipal elections made it crystal clear that the Spanish people had turned against the monarchy entirely, Alfonso did not abdicate formally. He simply left. He walked out of Spain, boarded a ship, and went into exile in Rome, quietly insisting until his death that he was still the rightful king. He never returned. He died in Rome in 1941, 2 years into World War II, a man who had been born a king and spent decades watching his crown dissolve, piece by piece, decision by decision, until there was nothing left to wear. Farooq I of Egypt began his reign as one of the most promising young monarchs in the Arab world. He was 16 years old, handsome, charismatic, educated in England, and genuinely beloved by Egyptians who saw in him the possibility of a modern, confident, independent Egypt. That promise was systematically destroyed, and the weapon used to destroy it was British colonial power. Britain controlled Egypt from behind a very thin veil of Egyptian sovereignty, and they made sure Farooq understood exactly who was really in charge. The moment that crystallized everything came in February 1942, during World War II, when British tanks surrounded his Abdeen Palace in Cairo, and the British ambassador walked in and gave him an ultimatum: appoint a pro-British prime minister or be removed from his throne immediately. Farooq complied. He had no choice. But something broke inside him that day that never healed. The humiliation of that moment, a foreign power rolling tanks up to his own palace and telling him what to do, poisoned his relationship with his role, with his country, and ultimately with himself. He retreated into a life of excess, gambling, parties, and corruption that alienated the Egyptian public. When the military coup came in 1952, led by officers who had grown up watching Egypt be humiliated, Farooq was exiled to Monaco. He spent the rest of his life eating in expensive restaurants, gambling in casinos, and collecting bizarre objects. A man who had been humiliated out of his own potential and spent the rest of his days running from that memory. Nicholas II of Russia is the final name on this list, and in many ways he is the most tragic of all. Not because he was the most oppressed, but because the gap between who he was as a person and what his role demanded of him was so enormous. And the consequences of that gap were so catastrophic that it ended not just his life, but the lives of everyone he loved most. Nicholas was, by all personal accounts, a genuinely kind and devoted man. He loved his wife Alexandra deeply. He was a tender and attentive father to his 5 children. He enjoyed simple things: long walks, photography, reading. In another life, in another time, he might have been a perfectly happy country gentleman. But he was the Tsar of Russia, ruler of the largest country on earth, at one of the most volatile moments in human history, and he was catastrophically ill-equipped for it. He distrusted advisors who told him hard truths. He made decisions based on emotion and divine faith rather than political reality. His son Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a secret the family kept desperately hidden, and the anxiety around Alexei's condition pushed Alexandra into a deep dependence on Rasputin, the mysterious mystic who claimed he could heal the boy. Rasputin's growing influence over the royal family scandalized Russian society and destroyed whatever credibility Nicholas had left among the aristocracy. He dragged Russia into World War I, where millions died in catastrophic military failures. He dismissed the parliament that might have saved him. He ignored warning after warning that revolution was coming. When it came, it swept everything away. Nicholas abdicated in 1917, was arrested with his family, moved from location to location by the Bolsheviks, and in the early hours of July 17, 1918, he, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, their son Alexei, and several servants were led into a basement in Yekaterinburg and shot. The most powerful man in Russia could not protect a single person he loved. He was not a tyrant destroyed by justice. He was a gentle, limited man who was handed a role that required a completely different kind of human being, and the world paid an almost unimaginable price for that mismatch. 10 thrones, 10 crowns, 10 lives consumed by power they never truly held. Puyi, who was a god at 2 and a gardener at 50. Henry, who prayed while his kingdom burned. Mustafa, whose mind was stolen before he ever ruled. Charles, who was born broken by his own bloodline. Guangxu, who tried everything and was poisoned for it. Ranavalona, who fought with every tool available and was exiled anyway. Ludwig, who built castles and was declared mad for dreaming. Alfonso, who was born a king and died in exile. Farooq, who was humiliated into his own destruction. And Nicholas, who loved his family more than anything and could not save a single one of them. These were not weak men and women. These were human beings placed inside systems so powerful, so unforgiving, and so indifferent to individual humanity that no amount of personal virtue or personal failure could change what was coming for them. History is not just the story of great decisions. It is the story of people trapped by circumstances larger than themselves, wearing crowns that were really just beautiful chains. If this kind of honest, deep history is what you are looking for, then subscribe right now. Hit that button, turn on notifications, and join this community. Because every week we go further into the real stories that the world forgot to tell you.